Bandage this wound, or my men will burn this diner to the ground with you inside." The bleeding man gasped, a heavy silver gun slipping from his crimson-stained fingers. Aubrey backed against the greasy sink, her heart hammering against her ribs. The massive stranger had just crashed through her kitchen door, dragging a trail of thick, dark blood across the checkered linoleum. His custom-tailored suit was ruined, his eyes cold and feral despite the impending shadow of death. "I'm just a waitress," Aubrey cried, panic locking her knees. "I don't know how to fix a bullet hole." "Learn," he rasped, clutching his shredded abdomen. "Patch me up tonight, and I swear to God, my army will remember your name tomorrow." The neon sign outside the diner flickered, casting rhythmic, sickly pink shadows across the greasy kitchen tiles. Aubrey's breath caught in her throat, her lungs suddenly feeling as though they had been filled with the freezing rainwater pouring in from the open alley door. The man on the floor was massive, easily over 6 feet, draped in a custom-tailored charcoal suit that was rapidly turning a wet, glistening black. The metallic tang of fresh blood immediately overpowered the heavy, familiar sense of stale coffee, burnt fryer oil, and industrial bleach that usually defined Aubrey's nights. She stood paralyzed, her hands still dripping with suds from the sink, her mind struggling to process the violent intrusion into her quiet, mundane reality. "Close the door," the man grunted, his head slumping against the edge of the stainless steel prep counter. His breathing was dangerously shallow, each inhalation accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that made Aubrey's stomach pitch. Survival instinct, honed by years of living on the edge of poverty in a city that ate the weak, finally kicked in. Aubrey didn't scream. She didn't reach for her phone. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy handle of the steel door and shoved it shut against the howling wind. The sudden silence in the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the hum of the ancient refrigerators and the man's ragged gasps. She locked the deadbolt with a trembling hand, then turned back to the intruder. He was losing blood fast. A thick, dark pool was already creeping across the black and white tiles, tracing the grout lines like a morbid, fast-moving river. Aubrey took a hesitant step closer. She could see the pristine white cuffs of his shirt, stained terribly red. He was clutching his lower right abdomen. "Who are you?" Aubrey whispered, her voice shaking violently. "Who did this to you? I have to call an ambulance. You're going to die here." The man forced his eyes open. Even clouded by pain, they were terrifying, a pale, icy blue that seemed to pierce right through her. He didn't look like a common street thug. Despite the blood and the rain, he exuded a terrifying aura of absolute authority. "No hospitals," he breathed, his jaw clenching as a spasm of agony racked his large frame. "No cops. I told you. Fix me, or you die." Aubrey backed away, her hands coming up defensively. "I'm a waitress. I serve pancakes and bad coffee. I don't know how to fix a bullet wound." "You figure it out," he ordered, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that brooked absolutely no argument. Now, panic threatened to overwhelm her, a rising tide of hysteria that threatened to lock her joints. She looked at the blood. She looked at his face. He was fading. If she did nothing, he would bleed out on her freshly mopped floor, and the police would tear her life apart investigating the murder. If the people who shot him followed his trail, they would both be killed. "Okay," Aubrey gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Okay, but you have to move. You can't stay in the middle of the floor. My manager will be here in 4 hours." She grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit jacket. The fabric was heavy, saturated with rain and blood. "Help me!" She strained, digging her cheap, non-slip shoes into the linoleum. "Push with your legs." With a guttural roar of sheer willpower, the man drove his heavy boots into the floor, pushing backward as Aubrey pulled. It was an agonizing, clumsy dance. They slipped on his blood, Aubrey falling to her knees at one point, her apron soaking up the crimson mess. She swore under her breath, a harsh, panicked sound, and scrambled back up. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they managed to drag him out of the main kitchen area and into the cramped, windowless dry storage pantry at the back of the building. Aubrey shoved aside heavy sacks of flour and boxes of industrial-sized canned tomatoes to make room. She propped him up against a stack of potato sacks, his head lolling to the side. The bare bulb overhead cast harsh, unforgiving light on his pale face. He looked worse now. His lips were taking on a bluish tint. "Stay with me," Aubrey ordered, her voice surprisingly sharp, surprising even herself. She slapped his cheek lightly. "Hey, don't pass out on me. I need to get things." The man's icy eyes fluttered open. "Hurry," he whispered. Aubrey sprinted back into the kitchen. Her mind was racing, cataloging every item in the diner that could possibly be used for trauma care. The first aid kit in the manager's office was a joke, just cartoon bandages and expired aspirin. She needed real supplies. She grabbed the largest stack of clean, white cotton bar towels she could find. She filled a plastic bus tub with scalding hot water from the coffee machine's tap. She remembered the bottle of cheap, overproof vodka the line cook kept hidden behind the deep fryer for after-shift drinks. She grabbed that too, along with a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a pair of poultry shears. When she returned to the pantry, the man was unconscious. Aubrey dropped to her knees beside him, the hard floor biting into her kneecaps. She had no medical training, nothing but basic common sense and a desperate, burning desire not to let a man die on her watch. She took a deep, shuddering breath, uncapped the vodka, and prepared to do the impossible. Aubrey didn't have time to second-guess herself. The man she needed a name, something to anchor him to humanity, but she didn't have one was slipping away. She grabbed the poultry shears, her fingers slipping slightly on the plastic handles due to the slickness of his blood on her skin. With harsh, jagged motions, she cut through the expensive, ruined wool of his suit jacket, tossing the heavy garment aside. Next was his dress shirt. As she ripped the white cotton open, she gasped. The wound was horrific. It wasn't a clean entry. It looked jagged, messy, located in his lower right side, just above the hip bone. Blood was pulsing from it in a steady, terrifying rhythm that matched his weakening heartbeat. "Oh, God!" Aubrey breathed, her hands hovering uselessly for a fraction of a second. "Oh, my God! I can't do this," the man groaned, a low, animalistic sound of pure suffering. His head rolled, and his eyes cracked open, unfocused and cloudy. "Do it!" he hissed, his teeth bared in agony. Aubrey snapped out of her paralysis. "This is going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot," she warned, her voice trembling. She grabbed the bottle of cheap vodka. Without waiting for him to brace himself, she poured a generous, stinging splash directly over the open wound. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The man's eyes flew wide open, rolling back in his head, his entire body convulsed, lifting off the floor as a roar of pure, unfiltered agony tore from his throat. He reached out blindly, his massive hand clamping around Aubrey's wrist with bone-crushing force. She whimpered, feeling as though her arm might snap, but she didn't pull away. "Breathe!" she yelled over his groan. "Just breathe!" He fell back against the potato sacks, chest heaving, his grip on her wrist slowly loosening. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the grime and rain. Aubrey didn't hesitate. She grabbed a stack of the clean white bar towels, wadded them up into a thick, dense pad, and pressed them directly into the wound. She leaned all her meager weight into it, pushing down with both hands. The blood immediately soaked through the first layer, blooming like a dark red rose against the white cotton. "Hold this," Aubrey commanded, grabbing his hand and forcing it over hers onto the towel. "Hold it tight. Don't let go." He was weak, but he complied, his large fingers overlapping hers. Aubrey grabbed another towel, dipped it into the tub of scalding water, and began to wipe away the excess blood from his torso, trying to see if there was an exit wound. She rolled him slightly to the side. He let out a sharp hiss, but there was no secondary hole in his back. The bullet was still inside him. "The bullet is still in there," Aubrey said, panic rising in her throat again. "I can't take it out. I don't have tools. I'll kill you if I dig for it." "Leave it," he grunted, his voice incredibly strained. "Just stop the bleeding." Aubrey nodded frantically. She grabbed the roll of heavy-duty duct tape. "I have to bind it. Lift your arms." It was an awkward, agonizing process. He could barely move. Aubrey had to lean entirely over him, practically straddling his legs in the cramped pantry, to pass the roll of tape beneath his back. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and copper up close, despite the pallor of near death. The sharp, aristocratic lines of his face were striking. This was a man used to giving orders, a man who commanded rooms simply by entering them. And now he was entirely at the mercy of a waitress making minimum wage. She wrapped the duct tape tightly around his waist, binding the thick pad of towels securely against the wound. She went around 3 times, pulling the tape as taut as she physically could, effectively creating a crude, brutal pressure dressing. When she finished, she fell back onto her heels, exhausted. Her chest was heaving, her apron and uniform completely ruined, stained dark red. Her hands were shaking violently now that the immediate adrenaline was receding. The man leaned back, his eyes closed. His breathing was still shallow, but the terrifying pulsing of blood had stopped. The makeshift bandage was holding. "For now, thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator outside the door. Aubrey wiped a streak of blood off her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Don't thank me yet. You might still die of an infection." That was well vodka. A faint ghost of a smirk touched the corner of his pale lips. It was a surprising expression, humanizing him in an instant. "I'm Leo," he said softly. "Aubrey?" she replied, her voice shaky. "Aubrey," Leo repeated, testing the sound of it. He opened his eyes, and the icy blue was a little clearer now, locking onto her with intense focus. "You saved my life tonight, Aubrey. I don't forget things like that. Just try not to die in my pantry, Leo," Aubrey said, pulling her knees to her chest in the cold, windowless room. "I can't afford to lose this job." The hours that followed were a waking nightmare, a surreal suspension of time where Aubrey felt trapped in a purgatory of fluorescent light and the smell of drying blood. She couldn't stay in the pantry with him. The diner still needed to be closed, the registers counted, the floors mopped. If the morning manager, a strict, eagle-eyed woman named Brenda, found the place a wreck, Aubrey would be fired on the spot. Leaving Leo propped against the flour sacks, she locked the pantry door from the outside and went back into the main kitchen. The sight of the floor made her want to weep. The blood had coagulated into sticky, dark puddles. It took her 3 rounds with the mop, a heavy dose of industrial bleach, and frantic scrubbing with a wire brush to get the red stains out of the porous grout. Every time a car drove past the diner, casting sweeping headlights through the rain-streaked front windows, Aubrey flinched, terrified it was the men who had shot Leo, returning to finish the job. Around 3 a.m., the storm finally broke, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence. Aubrey finished her tasks, her muscles aching, her mind completely numb. She made a pot of fresh black coffee, poured a mug, and unlocked the pantry door. Leo was still there, exactly where she had left him, For a terrifying second, as she saw his chest wasn't moving, she thought he was dead. She dropped to her knees, her hand flying to his neck to check his pulse. The skin was burning hot to the touch. The fever had set in. "Leo," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Leo, wake up," he groaned, tossing his head side to side. Sweat drenched his hair, making the dark strands stick to his forehead. He was trapped in a fever dream, muttering words in a language Aubrey couldn't understand. It sounded like Italian, rapid and angry. His hands twitched, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Aubrey wet a clean towel with cold water and gently pressed it to his burning forehead. She stayed with him for the next 2 hours, continuously re-wetting the cloth, murmuring quiet, meaningless words of comfort to keep him tethered to reality. In his delirium, the terrifying aura of the man vanished. He was just a vulnerable, broken human being, fighting a desperate battle against his own failing body. As she sat there, listening to his ragged breathing, Aubrey couldn't help but reflect on the utter absurdity of her situation. She was 24 years old, drowning in medical debt, left behind by her late mother's cancer treatments, working double shifts just to keep the bank from foreclosing on her tiny, rundown childhood home. She was invisible. She was a ghost serving coffee to other ghosts at 3 in the morning. And now, she was the sole lifeline for a man who clearly belonged to a dark, violent world she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Around 5 a.m., the sky outside began to turn the color of a bruised plum. The fever finally broke. Leo's breathing evened out, and the violent shivering stopped. He opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh light of the pantry bulb. "Water," he croaked. Aubrey quickly held a plastic cup to his lips, helping him drink. He swallowed greedily, then coughed, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged side. He looked down at the thick ring of silver duct tape around his waist, then back up at Aubrey. "You stayed," he said, his voice stronger now, the gravelly tone returning. "I couldn't exactly leave," Aubrey replied, her exhaustion making her blunt. "My shift doesn't end until 6. Leo slowly pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the wall. His face was drawn and pale, but the deadly, focused intelligence was back in his eyes. He checked the heavy gold watch on his wrist, a timepiece that Aubrey recognized cost more than her entire house. "I have to go," he said simply. Aubrey stared at him, incredulous. "Are you insane? You can barely stand. You have a bullet inside you. If you walk out there, you'll bleed out in the alley. If I stay here, I bring the war to your doorstep, Aubrey," Leo said, his tone final. "My people are looking for me, but the people who did this are looking too. It's not safe for you." He forced himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously, nearly collapsing, but caught himself on the metal shelving unit. He took a slow, agonizing breath, marshalling a terrifying amount of willpower. He looked at Aubrey, standing there in her blood-stained uniform, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was shockingly tender for a man who looked capable of such violence. "You saved my life," Leo said quietly, locking his piercing blue eyes onto hers. "I am in your debt, and a debt to me is sacred." Before she could respond, he turned and limped out of the pantry. Aubrey followed him to the back door. He paused, leaning against the doorframe, leaving a smear of blood on the white paint. He opened the door, the cool morning air rushing in. "Lock this behind me," he ordered, not looking back. "And forget you ever saw me." He stepped out into the pre-dawn gray, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Aubrey stood there for a long moment, shivering in the cold air, before slowly closing the heavy steel door and throwing the deadbolt. The sunlight, when it finally broke over the city skyline, felt offensive. It was too bright, too cheerful for a world that had just seen so much blood. Aubrey practically sleepwalked through the final hour of her shift. When Brenda, the morning manager, arrived at 6:30, Aubrey was sitting in a booth, staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee. Brenda, a sharp-featured woman who treated the diner like a military barracks, immediately zeroed in on Aubrey's appearance. "Good Lord, Aubrey, you look like you crawled out of a grave. And what on earth happened to your apron?" Aubrey looked down at the dark, rusted stains on her uniform. Panic flared briefly, but exhaustion quickly smothered it. "I spilled a whole vat of cherry syrup in the back," she lied, her voice flat and dead. "Took me hours to clean it up. I'm just really tired." Brenda frowned, inspecting the kitchen. Thanks to Aubrey's frantic bleaching, nothing seemed amiss, though the faint smell of bleach was overpowering. "Fine, go home. You're scaring the breakfast regulars. Take tomorrow off too. You look awful." Aubrey didn't argue. She grabbed her worn canvas coat and walked out the front door, stepping into the crisp morning air. The walk to her house was usually a 20-minute blur of gray sidewalks and rundown storefronts. Today, every step felt like she was wading through wet concrete. Every passing car made her flinch. Every shadow in an alleyway looked like a man bleeding out. She lived in a neighborhood that had been slowly dying for a decade. Her house, a tiny single-story bungalow with peeling blue paint and a sagging front porch, was the only thing she owned in the world. It was a physical manifestation of her mother's memory, a sanctuary she was fighting tooth and nail to keep out of the bank's hands. Aubrey unlocked the front door, the familiar squeak of the hinges offering no comfort today. The house was cold and silent. She locked the door behind her, threw the deadbolt, and latched the chain. Then, her legs finally gave out. She slid down the front door, burying her face in her hands, and began to shake. The adrenaline was entirely gone, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror. What had she done? She had aided a criminal, a dangerous man. The cold, dead look in his eyes when he threatened her life played on a loop in her mind. He was mob. He had to be. Nobody else wore suits like that or got shot in alleys and refused hospitals. She stripped off her uniform in the bathroom, staring at the dried blood on her own skin. She scrubbed herself in the shower until her skin was raw and red, trying to wash away the memory of the night. But the metallic smell of copper seemed permanently burned into her sinuses. She collapsed into her small, unmade bed, exhausted to her very bones, but sleep refused to come. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. She lay awake for hours, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, waiting for the police to kick down her door, or worse, for the men who shot Leo to find her. By late afternoon, she forced herself to get up. The silence of the house was suffocating her. She needed noise. She turned on the small, ancient television in the living room, flipping to the local news channel, seeking some mundane distraction. Instead, the screen froze her blood. The breaking news banner glared in bright red across the bottom of the screen. Major escalation in underworld war. The anchor, a serious-looking man with perfect hair, was speaking rapidly over footage of police tape cordoning off a high-end restaurant downtown. Authorities are confirming a massive shootout occurred late last night in the warehouse district, believed to be an ambush targeting alleged organized crime figure, Leo Castiglione. Police sources indicate Castiglione, the reputed head of the powerful Castiglione family, was heavily wounded in the crossfire and is currently missing. Hospitals across the tri-state area are on high alert. Aubrey stopped breathing. The remote control slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. Leo Castiglione. She didn't just help a criminal. She had patched up the boss of the city's most brutal, feared crime syndicate. A man whose name was whispered with terror in her neighborhood, a man who supposedly controlled politicians, police chiefs, and an army of ruthless enforcers. And she had yelled at him to lift his arms so she could tape him up with duct tape. Aubrey sank to her knees in front of the television, a cold wave of absolute certainty washing over her. She was a dead woman walking. The people who ambushed him would be looking for anyone who helped him. And Leo's own people? They wouldn't want a random waitress knowing that their invincible boss had been reduced to bleeding on a diner floor. Loose ends in that world were always tied up. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slowly back and forth on the living room rug. The long night at the diner had been terrifying, but it was nothing compared to the crushing, inescapable dread that now settled over her. She had survived the night, but she knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that she wouldn't survive the week. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in paranoia. Aubrey didn't leave her house. She kept the blinds drawn tightly shut, plunging the small bungalow into perpetual twilight. She jumped at the sound of the mail carrier dropping letters through the slot. She barely ate, her stomach tied in agonizing knots of pure anxiety. By Tuesday afternoon, the claustrophobia became unbearable. The walls of her house felt like they were shrinking, pressing in on her. She was out of coffee, out of bread, and desperately needed to feel the sun on her face to prove she was still alive. Rationalizing that starving in her living room wouldn't save her, she grabbed her coat and a worn baseball cap, pulling it low over her eyes, and ventured out to the small corner bodega 2 blocks away. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. It was a subtle change, but to someone who had lived there her whole life, it was as loud as a siren. The streets, usually bustling with kids playing and neighbors arguing on porches, were unnervingly quiet. People moved quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. There was a palpable tension in the air, a heavy electric pressure preceding a violent storm. As Aubrey walked, she noticed the cars. Black, late-model SUVs with heavily tinted windows were slowly cruising the narrow streets. They weren't police vehicles. They moved with a slow, predatory grace, pausing at intersections, lingering near alleyways. Aubrey pulled her collar up, her heart hammering against her ribs. They're looking for him, she thought frantically. Or they're looking for me. She ducked into the bodega, the bell above the door ringing far too loudly. Mr. Kim, the elderly owner who usually greeted her with a warm smile, looked up sharply, his face tight with worry. He was listening to a portable radio behind the counter. The volume turned down low. "Quickly today, Aubrey," Mr. Kim murmured as she placed a loaf of bread and instant coffee on the counter. He kept glancing out the front window. "Not a good day to be on the street. Bad men are out." "I know," Aubrey whispered, handing him a crumpled $10 bill. "What are they saying on the radio?" Mr. Kim shook his head, bagging her items with trembling hands. "The big boss, Castiglione. They say he is dead. His men are tearing the city apart, looking for the shooters, going door to door in the southwards. It is a war, Aubrey. Go home. Lock your doors." Aubrey didn't wait for her change. She grabbed the plastic bag and hurried out, power walking back toward her house. The news that Leo might be dead hit her with a confusing mix of emotions. If he was dead, maybe she was safe. But if he was dead, his men were on a rampage of vengeance. And if they found out she was the last person to see him alive, she turned the corner onto her street and froze. Parked directly across from her house was a sleek, black Mercedes sedan. The engine was idling, a low, menacing purr. The windows were dark, giving nothing away. Aubrey's breath hitched. She stopped on the sidewalk, clutching the plastic grocery bag to her chest like a shield. Had they found her? Did someone see her dragging him into the diner? Did Leo tell them before he died? She forced herself to keep walking, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the cracked pavement. She didn't look at the car as she approached her front walkway. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them on the porch. She swore silently, scrambling to pick them up, hyper-aware of the dark windows of the Mercedes tracking her every move. Finally, the key slid into the lock. She threw the door open, practically falling inside, and slammed it shut, engaging the deadbolt, the chain, and a heavy wooden chair she wedged under the knob. She backed away from the door, panting heavily. The house was silent. Outside, the low hum of the Mercedes engine continued for a long, agonizing minute. Then, slowly, the engine revved, and the car pulled away, the sound fading down the street. Aubrey sank against the wall, sliding down to the floor. She was trapped. She couldn't run. She had no money, no car, nowhere to go. She was entirely at the mercy of forces she couldn't fight. As evening fell, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, the dread solidified into a heavy, cold weight in her stomach. She turned off all the lights in the house. She sat in the dark living room, wrapped in a blanket on the worn sofa, staring at the sliver of streetlights visible through the crack in the blinds. She waited for the inevitable. She waited for the knock. Hours passed. The neighborhood grew completely silent, save for the occasional bark of a stray dog. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the seconds of her life. Aubrey realized she hadn't cried yet. She was too terrified to cry. Around 10 p.m., the silence was broken. It started as a low rumble, a vibration she felt in the floorboards before she heard it. It sounded like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. The rumble grew louder, heavier. It wasn't one engine. It was dozens. Aubrey slowly stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She crept toward the front window, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She reached out with a trembling finger and pulled down one slat of the plastic blinds. The breath was punched out of her lungs. The street, her quiet, run-down street, was flooded with light. Headlights, piercing and bright, cut through the darkness from every direction. Black SUVs, heavy sedans, and sleek town cars were pulling up, parking on the lawns, blocking the intersections, filling every available inch of asphalt. And from the vehicles, men were emerging. There were dozens of them. No, hundreds. They were dressed in dark suits, heavy coats, their faces grim and set. They moved with terrifying precision, fanning out, securing the perimeter, taking up positions along the sidewalks, in her neighbors' yards, at the end of the alleyways. They were surrounding her house. The sheer scale of the operation unfolding outside her window was incomprehensible. Aubrey watched, paralyzed by absolute, suffocating terror, as the army of men silently laid siege to her small property. There had to be at least 200 of them. The streetlights glinted off the polished metal of firearms hastily concealed under heavy wool coats. Her mind fractured, logic failing entirely. Why so many? Why bring an army to kill one terrified waitress? It made no sense. It was overkill of the highest magnitude. Unless they weren't here just to kill her. Unless they were here to make an example of her. A brutal public display of what happens when you cross the Castiglione family. Aubrey stumbled back from the window, her legs turning to water. She collided with the coffee table, sending a stack of unopened medical bills scattering across the floor. She didn't feel the pain in her shin. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees until her back hit the wall in the darkest corner of the living room. The house was completely illuminated from the outside now. The harsh glare of dozens of high-beam headlights bled through the cheap plastic blinds, casting long, menacing, prison-bar shadows across the walls and ceiling. The low, synchronized idling of the massive engines vibrated through the foundation, making the floorboards hum beneath her. Outside, a profound, eerie silence settled over the army. No one was shouting, no one was giving orders. They stood in disciplined, terrifying stillness. A monolithic wall of dark suits and lethal intent facing her front door. Aubrey hugged her knees to her chest, rocking violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the harsh light. She thought of her mother, of the long battle with cancer in this very house, of how unfair it was that it was all going to end like this. She thought of Leo, of the blood on her hands, of the icy blue of his eyes when he promised her that a debt to him was sacred. He lied, she thought, a hysterical, bitter sob finally tearing loose from her throat. He's dead, and they've come to clean up his mess. Suddenly, the synchronized idling outside was cut. One by one, the engines were killed, plunging the street back into an unnatural quiet, broken only by the sound of car doors thudding shut in heavy succession. Then came the footsteps. It wasn't a rush. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of heavy boots on her gravel walkway. The sound was agonizingly slow, each step echoing loudly in the quiet house. They were walking up to her porch. Aubrey clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle the scream building in her lungs. She stared in horror at the front door, at the flimsy chain lock and the wooden chair she had wedged under the handle. It was pathetic. They could kick the door off its hinges with a single blow. The footsteps stopped right outside. The wooden floorboards of her porch groaned under the weight of several heavy men. Aubrey stopped breathing. She waited for the crash. She waited for the door to splinter inward, for the men to storm in with guns drawn. She braced herself for the violence, for the end. Instead, there was a knock. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a police raid, nor the aggressive hammering of a mob hit. It was 3 sharp, distinct, polite knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The civility of the sound was more terrifying than a battering ram. It was the sound of absolute control. They knew she was inside. They knew she couldn't run. They were simply asking her to surrender. Aubrey. The voice that filtered through the heavy wood of the door was not loud, but it carried a commanding resonance that cut through the silence like a blade. It was a voice she recognized, a gravelly, wet rasp that she had heard pleading for life on a dirty kitchen floor 2 nights ago. Aubrey's eyes snapped open wide. She froze, her hand still clamped over her mouth. It was impossible. He was dead. The news said he was dead. The blood loss alone should have killed him. Aubrey, the voice repeated, a little firmer this time. It's Leo. Open the door. A shockwave of disbelief crashed through her panic. She slowly lowered her hands. Her entire body was trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as she pushed herself up from the floor. She leaned against the wall for support. Her legs barely able to hold her weight, she crept toward the front hallway, staying out of the direct line of sight from the windows. She reached the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. She could hear the rustle of clothing, the quiet, disciplined breathing of the men standing behind him. How do I know it's you? Aubrey managed to whisper, her voice cracking horribly. There was a brief silence on the porch. Then, a low, rasping chuckle, because Leo's voice came through the door. If it wasn't me, you wouldn't be hearing a knock. And because I still smell like cheap well vodka, Aubrey squeezed her eyes shut. It was him. With trembling, clumsy fingers, she reached out. She pulled the wooden chair away from the knob. She unlatched the deadbolt. She slid the brass chain free. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever nightmare waited on the other side, and slowly pulled the door open. The cold night air rushed into the stale house, carrying with it the scent of exhaust and expensive cologne. Aubrey stood in the doorway, blinking against the glare of the headlights, feeling impossibly small. Standing on her porch, flanked by two towering men built like granite statues, was Leo Castiglione. He looked drastically different from the dying, blood-soaked man she had dragged into her pantry. He was wearing a long, immaculate black cashmere overcoat, draped over his shoulders, the sleeves empty, hiding his right side. Beneath it, she could see the crisp collar of a dark shirt. His face was still alarmingly pale, the sharp angles of his jaw stark beneath the porch light, and he leaned heavily on an elegant, silver-tipped cane gripped in his left hand. But he was alive, and the aura of terrifying, apex predator power radiating from him was absolute. Beyond him, filling the street, the lawns, and the sidewalks, stood his men. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed in utter silence on the small, terrified waitress standing in the doorway of the run-down bungalow. The sheer visual weight of it was staggering. Leo looked down at Aubrey. His icy blue eyes swept over her pale face, her trembling hands, taking in the absolute terror radiating from her. His expression softened infinitesimally, a subtle shifting of the hard lines around his mouth. "May I come in, Aubrey?" he asked quietly. Aubrey couldn't find her voice. She could only manage a jerky, terrified nod, stepping back to clear the doorway. Leo moved slowly, wincing slightly as he crossed the threshold. His two massive guards moved to follow him, their eyes scanning the interior of the house like targeting lasers. Leo raised his left hand, a minute gesture. "Wait outside," he commanded. Not looking back at them, the guard stopped instantly, stepping back onto the porch and closing the front door with a soft, final click, shutting out the glaring headlights and the army outside. The living room was cast back into shadows, illuminated only by the faint light from the street and the small lamp Aubrey had left on in the kitchen. Leo stood in her cramped hallway, looking entirely out of place, a wolf forced into a birdcage. "I apologize for the theatrics," Leo said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet house. He leaned on his cane, scanning the modest, shabby living room. He noticed the pile of unopened medical bills scattered on the floor by the coffee table. "My people are overprotective right now. There's a price on my head, and they insisted on a full perimeter." Aubrey finally found her voice, though it was barely a squeak. "The news said you were dead." "A strategic necessity," Leo replied calmly. "It flushes the rats out into the open when they think the cat is gone. I've spent the last 48 hours dealing with the men who tried to kill me." His eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, a terrifying glimpse into the violence he was capable of. "They are no longer an issue." Aubrey swallowed hard, her mouth bone dry. "Then, why are you here? If you're safe, why bring an army to my house? Are you going to kill me to keep me quiet?" Leo looked at her, genuinely taken aback. A flicker of something akin to hurt crossed his icy features. He took a slow, painful step toward her. "Aubrey," he said, his voice remarkably gentle. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I am alive right now because a terrified girl with a bottle of cheap vodka and a roll of duct tape refused to let me bleed out on a dirty floor," Leo said, his words measured and heavy with gravity. "In my world, loyalty is bought, and betrayal is common. But a life given freely, without expectation of reward, that is rare. That is sacred." He reached inside his heavy overcoat. Aubrey flinched instinctively, but he only pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He held it out to her. "I told you I don't forget," Leo said. Aubrey stared at the envelope, her hands firmly glued to her sides. "What is that?" "A settling of accounts," Leo replied. "I had my people look into your situation. The medical debt from your mother's illness, the mortgage arrears on this house, the fact that you're working 80 hours a week and still drowning." Aubrey felt a flush of hot shame mix with the fear. It was violating, knowing this powerful, dangerous man had laid bare the pathetic details of her struggling life. "You had no right to look into me," she whispered defensively. "I had every right to know who saved my life." Leo countered smoothly. He tossed the envelope onto the small table by the door. It hit with a heavy, solid thud. Inside that envelope are the deeds to this house, fully paid off. There are documents proving your medical debts have been completely erased, and there is a cashier's check that will ensure you never have to serve another cup of coffee as long as you live. Aubrey stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. The amount of money he was casually discarding was life-altering. It was everything she had prayed for, everything she had been killing herself to achieve, and it was soaked in blood. "I can't take that," Aubrey said, her voice shaking. But finding a sudden, surprising core of steel, she looked up at him, her chin lifting slightly. "I didn't save you for money. I saved you because you were a human being dying in front of me. I don't want mob money, Leo." Leo didn't look angry. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, lighting up his eyes and making him look terrifyingly handsome. "I knew you would say that," he murmured. Leo shifted his weight, resting both hands on the silver handle of his cane. The quiet authority he exuded filled the small living room, pressing against the peeling wallpaper. "You misunderstand the nature of the envelope, Aubrey," Leo said, his tone patient, like a professor explaining a complex theory. "It isn't a reward. It isn't a bribe to keep you quiet. It is a rebalancing of the scales. You gave me my life back. This is simply me giving yours back to you." "It's dirty money," Aubrey insisted, though her eyes kept darting back to the thick manila package on the table. The thought of the crushing weight of her mother's hospital bills vanishing overnight was a siren song, pulling at her exhaustion. "It is clean," Leo countered smoothly. "Liquidated assets from legitimate businesses I own. The debt collectors have been paid through a blind trust. The bank holding your mortgage received a wire transfer from an overseas shell company that cannot be traced back to me or to anyone in my organization. You are entirely insulated." He took another slow, painful step toward her. The scent of him rich cologne and the faint, sterile smell of fresh bandages was overwhelming. "If you throw that envelope away," Leo continued, his blue eyes locking onto hers, "the bank will foreclose on this house by the end of the month. The debt collectors will garnish the minimum wage you make at that diner until you are broken. You will lose everything your mother fought to leave you." He paused, letting the harsh truth sink in. "Pride is a luxury for the wealthy, Aubrey. You cannot afford it." Aubrey hated him in that moment. She hated him for being right. She hated him for stripping away her illusions of noble poverty and forcing her to confront the brutal reality of her survival. She felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, a mixture of profound relief and deep resentment. "Why do you care?" she demanded, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a mob boss. You ruin lives. Why go through all this trouble for a waitress?" Leo's expression hardened, the mask of the ruthless leader slipping back into place. "Because I am alive, and my enemies are dead. Because when I was bleeding out on that floor, you were the only person in this city who didn't see a target, or a payday, or a monster. You just saw a man who needed help." He looked away, staring at the faded floral pattern of the wallpaper. "In my life, Aubrey, you don't survive by leaving debts unpaid. It creates weakness. I cannot owe you my life. I must repay it, in full, so that we are square." Aubrey slowly walked over to the table. Her hand trembled as she reached out and touched the heavy envelope. It felt warm, substantial. It held her entire future. "If I take this," she said quietly, her back to him, "what happens then? Do I belong to you? Do you own me now?" "No," Leo said immediately, his voice sharp with command. The opposite. If you take that, the debt is settled. We are even. He turned to face her, leaning heavily on the cane. The exertion of the conversation, and simply standing, was clearly taking a toll on his still recovering body. He looked pale, lines of strain tight around his mouth. But Leo continued, his tone shifting, becoming darker, more serious. The fact remains that you were involved. The people who tried to kill me are gone, but nature abhors a vacuum. Others will rise. Whispers travel fast in my world. Someone might eventually piece together where I was that night. They might look into the diner. They might look into you. Aubrey's blood ran cold. The brief spark of relief provided by the envelope vanished, replaced by the crushing terror that had haunted her for the last 2 days. So, I'm not safe. You are safer than anyone in this city, Leo stated, absolute conviction ringing in every word. He gestured with his free hand toward the front window, indicating the 200 heavily armed men standing silently in her yard and down her street. They are not here to threaten you, Aubrey. They are here to be seen, Leo explained. By tomorrow morning, every criminal, every gang, every associate in this city will know that 200 of Castiglione's men surrounded your house. They will know that I personally walked through your front door. He locked his icy eyes onto hers, conveying a promise that was heavier than any threat. They won't know why. They will just know that you are under my personal protection. To touch a hair on your head, to even look at you sideways, will be considered an act of war against the entire Castiglione family. Leo's voice dropped to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. You are untouchable, Aubrey. Forever. Aubrey stood frozen, processing the magnitude of what he was saying. He hadn't brought an army to kill her. He had brought an army to crown her. He was wrapping her in a mantle of absolute terror and power, using his own dark reputation as an impenetrable shield around her fragile life. I don't know what to say, Aubrey stammered, overwhelmed by the sheer, imposing reality of the man standing in her hallway. You say nothing, Leo replied, a faint ghost of a smile returning to his pale lips. You pay your taxes, you fix your house, you sleep through the night. He turned slowly, maneuvering his cane toward the front door. He reached out and grasped the brass knob. He paused, looking back over his shoulder at her. And Aubrey, yes? She whispered. I bought the diner, Leo said casually, as if mentioning he bought a cup of coffee. The deed is in the envelope with the rest of the papers. You own it now. He smirked. Fire, Brenda. I never liked the way she yelled at you. With a soft click, the front door closed, leaving Aubrey alone in the quiet hallway. For a long time, she didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at the heavy wooden door, the thick manila envelope clutched tightly in her hands against her chest. Outside, the synchronized roar of high-powered engines shattered the night silence. She walked over to the window and carefully peeked through the blinds. The army was departing. The black SUVs and sedans were pulling away from the curbs, rolling smoothly down the street in a disciplined, intimidating convoy. The men were gone from her lawn, their heavy footprints the only evidence they had ever been there. Within 5 minutes, the street was entirely empty, returning to the quiet, run-down neighborhood she had always known. Except it wasn't the same. It would never be the same again. Aubrey walked slowly to the worn sofa and sat down. She opened the envelope. Leo hadn't lied. Inside were the notarized deeds to her house and the diner where she had slaved away for years. There were official letters from collection agencies, stamped with red ink declaring her mother's accounts paid in full. And at the very bottom was a certified cashier's check made out to her name. The number printed on it had so many zeros it made Aubrey dizzy. She let the papers fall onto her lap, burying her face in her hands. The tears finally came. They weren't tears of terror anymore. They were tears of an exhaustion so profound it felt like it had been settled in her bones for years, finally breaking apart and washing away. She was free. The next few weeks were a surreal blur of adjustment. Aubrey quit her job as a waitress, or rather, she walked into the diner, handed Brenda a severance package, and assumed ownership. She closed the place for a week, using a fraction of Leo's money to completely renovate the dingy kitchen, replacing the blood-stained linoleum with pristine, bright tile. She fixed the sagging porch on her house. She paid her property taxes 5 years in advance. She slept for 8 hours a night for the first time in her adult life. Yet, the shadow of Leo Castiglione never fully left her. She noticed it in the subtle ways the neighborhood changed around her. The local gang members who used to loiter on the corner near the bodega vanished. The police cruisers seemed to patrol her street with a quiet, respectful frequency. When she walked to the market, the tension in the air was gone, replaced by a wide, unspoken berth given to her by everyone she passed. She was the waitress who had summoned an army. She was the ghost who had become untouchable. 2 months later, on a quiet Tuesday evening, Aubrey was closing up the newly renovated diner. The neon sign outside buzzed cheerfully, casting a warm red glow over the clean tables. She was wiping down the front counter when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up, freezing mid-wipe. Leo stepped into the diner. He was fully healed, moving with the silent, predatory grace she had only seen glimpses of before. He wore a sharp, navy blue suit that fit perfectly. No sign of bandages or pain. He looked powerful, dangerous, and undeniably commanding. He didn't bring an army this time. He was completely alone. He walked over to the counter, taking a seat on one of the new red vinyl stools. He looked around the diner, noting the changes, the cleanliness, the bright new tile in the kitchen visible through the pass-through window. "It looks good, Aubrey," Leo said, his icy blue eyes meeting hers. "You've done well." Aubrey slowly set down the rag. Her heart gave a familiar, nervous flutter, but the sheer, blinding terror was gone. She looked at him, not as a mafia boss, but as the man she had dragged across the floor. "I had good capital to start with," Aubrey replied, her voice steady. She walked over to the coffee machine and poured a fresh mug, sliding it across the counter to him. "Black, no sugar, right?" Leo picked up the mug, inhaling the steam. "You remembered." "I remember everything about that night," Aubrey said quietly, leaning against the counter. "How are you feeling?" "Like a man who owes his life to a very stubborn woman," Leo replied, taking a sip of the coffee. He smiled, a genuine, warm expression that didn't reach the dark corners of his reputation. "I see you fired, Brenda." Aubrey let out a short, surprised laugh. "I gave her a generous severance." "I'm not a monster." Leo's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of intense, quiet respect. "No, Aubrey. You are the furthest thing from it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the chasm between their two worlds bridged by a shared, bloody secret. He was the darkness of the city, and she was the light he had accidentally stumbled into. "I just wanted to see for myself that you were okay," Leo said, setting the mug down and standing up. He buttoned his suit jacket. "That the investment was sound." "I'm okay, Leo," Aubrey said softly. "Thank you for everything." Leo paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked back at her, the neon light catching the sharp angles of his face. "You don't ever have to thank me, Aubrey. The debt is paid." "But," he hesitated, a rare moment of vulnerability for a man who controlled empires. "If you ever need anything at all, you know how to find me." "I know," Aubrey said. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect, and pushed out into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the city he ruled. Aubrey watched him go, feeling the weight of his protection surrounding her like a warm, heavy coat. She turned back to the counter, picked up her rag, and went back to work. No longer a ghost, but a woman entirely in control of her own destiny, watched over by the most dangerous guardian angel in the world.